Hello, everyone. I am admitting people into the meeting. There are some people in the waiting room, and then once pretty much everyone is in, we are going to start. All right, I'm going to wait for another couple of minutes because there are people who are arriving into the meeting room, the waiting room, sorry. Right. Attendees, ouch.
Is it as a front reacting to the decision yesterday? Obviously, they put it before.
Barbara's there. All right. All right, it's 12:05. I think we can begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to APLA's first Speaking Justice to Power event of the year. My name is Elif Babul. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at Holyoke College and President-elect of the Association for Political and Legal Anthropology, APLA. And this year, I will also be chairing APLA's Events Committee. We're very excited to kickstart this year with a very timely panel discussion on the US elections and inauguration. We have four distinguished speakers who will be sharing their analyses with us. This event is recorded and it will be published on APLA Polar's YouTube channel for viewing afterwards. We were hoping to live stream it on YouTube, but there were some technical difficulties and we were unable to do this at this time. But going forward, we're planning to use our YouTube channel more actively and live stream more of our events there, including the Speaking Justice to Power series, which we hope to revive as a platform to elaborate and respond to the developments happening inside and outside of the academia, within and beyond the US. So stay tuned and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Blue Sky, and our website. You can also subscribe to our listserv by emailing Daphne Ratchok at apla@politicalandlegalanthro.org in order to get periodical updates on APLA-related news and events. I pasted the relevant information on chat for people who would like to who would like to see it. You can actually click the links that I mentioned there. So without further ado, I want to start the event by introducing our wonderful panelists. I want to start with Carolyn Rouse, who is the Ritter Professor of Anthropology at Princeton University. Her research focuses on race and inequality explored through the fields of religion, medicine, development, and education. In her latest work, she has been investigating the declining life expectancies of white Americans in rural California, white privilege, and the notion of reverse racism in the Trump era. She is the author of many articles and books, including Engaged Surrender, African American Women and Islam, published by UC Press, 2004, Uncertain Suffering, Racial Healthcare Disparities, and Sickle Cell Disease, published by UC Press in 2009, and Televised Redemption, Black Religious Media and Racial Empowerment, published by NYU Press in 2016, which she co-wrote with John Jackson and Marla Frederick. Professor Rouse is also a filmmaker. Her documentary films include Chicks in White Satin in 1994, Purification to Prozac, Treating Mental Illness in Bali in 1998, and Listening as a Radical Act, World Anthropologies and the Decentering of Western Thought in 2015. Dr. Rouse is also currently serving as the president-elect vice president of the American Anthropological Association, and she will assume the office of the association president at the 2025 AAA meetings. Next, we have Alex Hinton, who is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, the Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, and UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention at Rutgers University. His research focuses on genocide and political violence. He's worked in Cambodia and South Asia, lately in the United States. In 2016, he testified as an expert witness at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. He has authored many books, including It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the United States, published by NYU Press in 2021. Anthropological Witness, Lessons from the Rising Threat of Genocide. Anthropological Witness, Lessons from the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, published by Cornell University Press in 2022, and Perpetrators, Encountering Humanity's Dark Side, published by Stanford University in 2023. He is the recipient of many professional awards, such as the AAA's Roberts B. Texter and Family Prize for Excellence in Anticipatory Anthropology in 2009, and the Anthropology in the Media Award in 2022. After that, we have Micaela di Leonardo, who is Professor Emeritus at Northwestern University. She is an anthropologist and interdisciplinary scholar whose work focuses on socioeconomic inequalities experienced at the intersections of class, race, gender, and sexuality, explored through the formation of public spheres and counter-publics, mainly in urban America. She's the author of The Varieties of Ethnic Experience, Kinship, Class, and Gender Among California Italian Americans, published by Cornell University Press, 1984, Exotics at Home, Anthropologies, Others, American Modernity, Chicago Press, 1998, and Black Radio, Black Resistance, The Life and Times of the Tom Joyer Morning Show, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. In addition to those, Professor Leonardo has written many articles and edited three anthologies: Gender at the Crossroads of Knowledge, Feminist Anthropology in the Postmodern Era, published by California University Press, 1991. The Gender Sexuality Reader, published by Rutgers in 1997, which she co-edited with Roger Lancaster, and New Landscapes of Inequality, Neoliberalism and the Erosion of Democracy in America, published by SAR Press in 2008, which she co-edited with Jane Collins and Brett Williams. And last but not least, we have Fred Damon, who is Professor Emeritus at University of Virginia. He has conducted research in Melanesia, East and South Asia, focusing on historical ecology, moral systems, value systems, production, exchange, and kinship, integrating structuralist and Marxist perspectives. Alongside many articles and book chapters, he wrote From Muyuv to the Trobrians, Transformations Along the Northern Side of the Kula Ring, published in 1990 by University of Arizona Press, and Trees, Nuts, and Outriggers, Environmental Knowledge in the Eastern Kula Ring, published in 2017 by Bergen Books. Later during his career, he turned his attention to the US culture in the contemporary world system. For years, he taught on American culture and everyday life, surveying the rituals of the Second Great Awakening, scapegoating rites such as lynchings, and the rise of the US as a major military power. In 2003, he published an article titled What Good Are the Elections?, where he analyzed American election cycles using classical anthropological paradigms such as the nature-culture divide, rites of passage, and mechanical versus organic solidarities. He delivered lectures on the Trump phenomenon in China, France, and Papua New Guinea. And lately, he has been working to revise his work on the elections as part of a book project based on his American culture course. So I would like to welcome once again all of our panelists and all of you, our listeners. So I asked the panelists to comment on the socio-political dynamics leading to Trump's victory, the inauguration event, and what to expect in the following 4 years. We will go with the order of introductions. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to share their initial comments. Following those, we will have another round of 10 minutes for each speaker where they can expand on their initial remarks or engage with each other's comments. And then after those 2 rounds, we will have Q&A and finish at 2 p.m. So I look forward to hearing how the complementary perspectives of the panelists will come together to provide valuable insights into the current movement. And with that, I give the floor to Carolyn Rouse.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody. I'm looking at the people in the room. Wow, a lot of people I can't wait to hear from. And the Q&A. So let me just get to it so we can get to the Q&A as fast as possible. Let me start by saying that with respect to the election, words fail me. And I don't mean it in the sense that I don't have an analysis for why Trump was reelected. I do have ideas. Maybe I could even call them theories about what happened. I've been conducting ethnographic research in rural California for 8 years. I'm finishing a book. I've been doing multiple iterations of a film that's in progress, really focusing on code enforcement as a way to take care. I separate this economy of things and the revitalization movement as an economy of care. So I have a lot of analyses, but I want to talk about this moment and why words fail me. And so I'm going to digress a bit about our anthropology and my struggle right now. So anthropology is often called a social science. I like to call it a social theory. Science indicates reproducibility, and it's not that. And behavioral scientists like to call themselves scientists because they like to translate social processes into numbers. They chunk, they categorize, all of this stuff. And that's why these categories are recognizable in the sense of math, right? And so we can count. So I'm a Black woman, and these are all translated into countable categories. But to put me into that category requires having a theory of history and systems, meaning you put me into that category because you think that my history and sense of history means I experience the world in a patterned way. You all know all of this. Social science numeracy is the way we were taught to make sense of social problems. There's biopolitics and biopower. Those are facets of social science numeracy. But we all do this. DEI programs are, describe yields of people who fit particular categories. And when we consider the scale of social problems, we often, translate these problems into numbers, migrants at the borders, income inequality. 200 years ago, people did not have access to these numbers. And so they didn't think in this way. It wasn't a natural way of thinking. And there were other ways to articulate social problems. What I like about anthropology is that many anthropologists have refused to consider volume necessarily translatable to value. And we know this from, Margaret Mead rejecting Stanley Hall's theory of adolescence with one example. She said one example is enough to challenge universality. Well, Black women in the United States are very diverse, and yet, social science numeracy puts us all into one category, just like white Americans are in this one category. So I use statistical data all the time in my research to articulate the scale of a problem according to data. Then I use qualitative research to treat the problem as both real and not real. It's a way to use the language of those who might read my work and use their language in order to scaffold, in the way that Marilyn Strathern talks about scaffolding, new ideas about what's going on with respect to white people, lower life expectancies, and commitments to Trump. So, but I wanted to really get into, tear apart some of what's going on. So can you put up the slide? So I wanted to put up a slide of a poll that was presented by the New York Times just a week ago. And it was at the top of the front page online, of the online newspaper. And the title of the poll is "Support for Trump's Policies Exceeds Support for Trump," which is a scary thought, right? Basically, we really all support Trump, is what the poll is saying. And so the poll is rather bleak. And they say, quote, "Many Americans who otherwise dislike President-elect Donald Trump share his bleak assessment of the country's problems and support some of the most contentious prescriptions to fix them," unquote. This finding was summed up by the following questions. Which of the following comes closest to your opinion about our nation's political system? And the choices included, quote, 1, "It has been broken for decades," the most votes. Quote, "It has been broken only for the last few years," unquote, or it is not broken. And the number of people who said "I don't know" was negligible. Exploring the survey in depth, it became clear that the questions and interpretation were nonsense. Okay, you can get rid of the slide, I think. So many of the questions simply mirrored talking points in the national news echo chamber led by Trump and Fox News. For example, one of the questions was, quote, "Society has gone too far in accommodating transgender people," unquote. There were no questions about the grid, the Postal Service, roads and bridges, things that actually matter to the quality of everyday life. With transgender athletes representing about 0.001% of student athletes, and in some states 0%, the question said more about the outsized power of news media to shape public perceptions and ideologies than anything else. To add to this, respondents were asked to either predict the future, summarize in one answer complicated policy questions, or answer in the singular a question that requires multiple answers. For example, quote, "Do you approve of Trump's cabinet picks?" unquote. There was no room to speak about individual cabinet nominees. Most infuriating is that the pollsters knew that the respondents were unaware of the factual data because opinions about crime contradict the data. The poll should have been interpreted as proof of how powerful mainstream news organizations are and how that power is being used to shape people's feelings toward a somewhat random set of concerns in ways that misinform. My interlocutors' feelings about Harris and Biden were a Trump and Fox News creation. And one of my interlocutors over the past 8 years, his feelings about Fox News have hardened. He spends about 4 hours a day watching Fox, forbidding any other news program in his house. The hosts were like friends who made him feel smart for agreeing with them. All Fox had to do was connect one piece of factual data. In this case, it was how the ACA made it impossible for him to get overtime. He connected that fact to believing that all Fox is right. He wasn't political before 2016, and now he's hardened. And so what the New York Times Ipsos poll showed was that propaganda works. The news diet of my interlocutors determined what they knew and how they felt. The opinion pollsters should have spent more time trying to analyze the question, the answer to the question, quote, generally, how satisfied are you with the way things are going in your life these days, unquote. 82% expressed satisfaction. For someone's life to be going well, government must be working. So this is what I mention this because progressives are also feeding into a kind of understanding of politics that isn't actually about their world. So they're producing ideology. And so what's interesting to me is that in the county where I work, they voted a little more for Trump than it's mostly purple. But national politics is not local politics. National politics is sort of the abstract. Local politics is not abstract. And overwhelmingly, people vote for progressive ideas at the local level. And so I think that we need to, going back to what I said at the beginning, I think we need to stop using the categories that we keep using, that the news organizations use to organize people and ideas. And I think we need to go back to best principles in anthropology of really trying from the ground up to understand how people organize their ideas. And I'll leave it at that for now and look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And our next up is Alex.
Yeah, hi. Let me see if I can share. If not, I will not share. And it looks like I will not be sharing because I have a new computer and it won't let me share. So that does that. I had some nice images there, though, of course, I could just be saying that. Yeah, so I'll just talk through things. And first of all, thank you for organizing this, and it's great to be here with many familiar names and my great colleagues today. When you said the questions again, the first is sort of how did we get here? And I was asking that, as many of you were, back in 1.0, Trump 1.0. And I wrote a book that was synchronic. It was diachronic as well. But it sort of went into moments of teaching. It went into what was happening in different sort of social ecologies, media, but also importantly, with regard to the question, place the current moment in 1.0 in terms of U.S. history. That book had the title "It Can Happen Here: White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the U.S." It came out in 2021, actually, finished in 2020. It takes forever for books to come out, but I got a preface in there and spoke about the insurrection. So the book, part of the argument of that, which pertains to the question, is that what we're going through is maybe spectacular, but it's not exceptional. It's symptomatic of a longer history, and there are lots of continuities. And certainly, if you look at different populist figures in the U.S. and go back through time, a lot of the rhetoric is very similar, like "Death of the West" by Buchanan, and there are others. So that book finished up, and I was like, okay, I'm all done. Right? So I wrote the book, took up the question. I'm on to new things under Biden. And at that time, I continued interest. I did not think I would be back to the question, sort of saying it can happen here. But I had a few research projects I began One was on replacement. And I have a chapter in It Can Happen Here on white genocide. And so one thing, if we think about 1.0 and 2.0, is we have these shifts that have taken place. And one was back in 1.0, the term white genocide was a popular term in far-right extremist circles. If you go to the Turner Diaries, working through into the present with many KKK, neo-Nazi groups. And then in Europe, in 2015, and certainly it was sort of, you could see it with Anders Breivik, the Norway shooter, Dylan Roof. We sort of moved through time, and the discourse of replacement actually began to sort of take over the discourse of white genocide in the US. So if we sort of look at the shifts, one thing is, well, you can basically talk about replacement, whereas you would never be able to talk about white genocide. And that term was contested in 1.0. Now it's more or less talked about all the time, often indirectly, but through all the discourse surrounding immigration. So sort of look back to now, and this sort of links, there's a term that was often used in the far right, it links into debates about cultural Marxism and different things, called the Overton window. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And this was a very explicit strategy by people on the far right to shift the boundaries of what is acceptable to say. And it worked. And part of it was facilitated through social media and different terminology. But now, as we saw with Elon Musk, and again, we don't know his mind for sure, but certainly it looked a lot like a Nazi salute. I don't know for sure, but certainly that would have been paid attention to. It got a little bit of attention. But again, 1.0 versus 2.0, and now we have these shifts that have gone on. Things that you couldn't really say before were considered inappropriate are now normalized and mainstreamed. I think, again, with Carolyn unpacking, people say, oh, the Trump voter. And I should note, with my research more recently, especially as we got into 2023, I've been doing, I call it MAGA research, I guess, and sort of began going to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, some of you may know about, and doing event ethnography there. I've been to the last two. I've written articles after being there, and I'm going to the one that's coming up, and other domains like that. And I've also been working on depolarization, which of course means you're doing both polarization and depolarization with grassroots organizations that try and cross the red-blue divide. That's a longer story. Anyway, so this lays sort of the terrain, but, so through the conversations, as the election was taking place, first of all, I saw, the stuff that's going on now is not a surprise. You go back to CPAC in 2023 and all the same stuff was basically being told at that moment. It's shocking to see some of it being formulated in executive orders that ultimately have impact, but have less impact than people think they do. But you see the shift from 1.0 to 2.0 with if you look at if you go back to the polls again, the voting base of Trump predominantly was older, white, less educated, and religious, and that really shifted to some degree. And this last round is many of you are aware, where in virtually every category people flip towards, virtually not every, but virtually every category there were shifts towards Trump. And he won groups like Latinos, 56%, I think, broke for him. Different younger males, many of them broke for him. And so the sort of talking about the Trump voter is complicated. Why did he win? I'll give you my take in a word. So I went to, as part of my research, I went to like a dozen Trump rallies in the lead up to, well, not just Trump, but there are Trump rallies and then there's sort of satellite rallies. There's a thing called the Trump bus that goes around and people come out, and many of them now have positions, the new administration, and they go around. So I got all sorts of different things. There was one sign that always stood out, the, sort of messaging and clarity of messaging for Trump was crystal clear. And I think the messaging was much more difficult for Democrats for various reasons. But, one sign simply had Trump low prices, Harris high prices. And the amount of talk and focus on inflation was both explicit and implicit. But I think if you hadn't had inflation, the election would have been very close. And also, if you've been able to mobilize the turnout, because it was actually depressed turnout that really hit the Democrats, things could have been very different. So it was really just sort of one issue that I think, and if you could have mobilized voters, it would have looked different. So people have talked about this, but immigration was the theme, obviously. The one that got sort of the most people roused up the most was actually wasn't sort of woke alone. It wasn't DEI. It was actually trans issue. That one, people would stand up and they would yell. Which isn't a surprise, but another shift that took place is we moved from talking about cultural Marxism and then political correctness into this woke, radical leftist, socialist, Marxist, what have you, discourse. But really, when you got the trans issue focused on, first it was critical race theory, but it was really the trans issue that at these different events would really get people stirred up. And there was very good messaging on the part of Republicans to hit on this. Anyways, that's a longer story. And then there's his charisma. So how did he win? Well, I don't think it's that hard to really figure out how he won. Where are we going? And I'll go quickly. I think, in contrast to some, I don't view Trump as an ideologue. I think he has three things he wants to do. We can call them the three M's. One is MAGA to an extent, where, I think he does generally want to, quote unquote, do something like make America great, but it relates to the second and third M. Second M is me. He has ego gratification issues, and so other things all sort of backlight to him. And the other is money, making deals. And I think, Biden, although you could also say it was true about the Biden administration in terms of oligarchy, I'm hesitant to use big words that mask complex realities, but certainly the moneyed interests. So I think in the backdrop, we have sort of money making, ego gratification, and a sort of view that I think Trump may well hold now that he's sort of anointed to be president based on surviving the assassination attempt. We have other things like rising Christian nationalism. But I think I wasn't timing myself. I'm guessing that I'm, probably at my time limit. I am. So I was going to talk about the dangers, and I'll just give two in about 2 sentences. I had a lot more to say, but I won't say it. The first is what's, I think, almost inevitable is that Trump is going to fail to deliver the American dream, as he calls it. He's going to fail to make America great again. There are going to be problems. It's inevitable. This is my take. And what do? In that situation? You blame people. So it's going to be the escape hunt. The things that he said, there's a witch hunt, will be flipped over and will begin to take place. Lawfare, which is mobilized against him, he will be mobilizing, he already is. So that's the one danger that will be during the course of the Trump administration. More broadly, with my project, it can happen here. Authoritarianism is the Orban model. Is the one that I worry about. People say, oh, fascism, Nazi Germany, that's misdirected. It's the Viktor Orban model. We could talk about that later if you want. Anyways, I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Alex. So next we will turn to Micaela to hear her initial comments.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, all. This is an inexpressibly painful topic of discussion. An inexpressibly painful reality we all globally have to deal with for the next 4 years and beyond. I thank Professor Elif Babul for organizing this anthropology panel to discuss the horror we all face now. I'll keep my remarks to the 10-minute limit. First, my background. I'm a cultural anthropologist and an interdisciplinary scholar of race, class, and gender in the U.S., of global political economy, and of Western intellectual and political history. I also became a media scholar for my last big project, an account of the origins and political effects of the most consequential Black American radio show ever, the Tom Turner Morning Show, which was founded in 1994 and ended in December 2019, and had an 8 million daily audience across the country. I've also been a left feminist, anti-racist activist since the early 1970s on both coasts, and for the last several decades in the Midwest. Thus, my remarks today arise from both my scholarship and my participation in progressive social movements over more than the last half century, old age does have benefits. As I wrote in a recently published economic anthropology piece, the crises of our times cannot be overstated. We have endemic war, massive displaced populations, pandemics, the disappearance of middle classes globally, and with the vast increase in the hyper-wealthy and impoverished populations, environmental catastrophes, and the proliferation of authoritarian, trending fascist leaders whose policies demonize large swaths of the national population, distracting people from their exploitation by the ruling classes. And that was before the 2024 presidential election. We have indeed been yanked back. We have yanked the entire globe into an ecological death spiral. While we certainly need analyses of how authoritarianism/fascism is growing in the US and so many other nation states, we also must never abandon historical political economic analysis. That is, it's not just authoritarianism or proto-fascism. It's also neoliberal capitalism. Hitler, after all, ran a state-subsidized amalgam of services and benefits for ordinary Gentile, non-leftist Germans, whereas Trump and his billionaire buddies have no intention of offering benefits to anyone but themselves, as we just saw him kill Biden's deal to lower Medicare prescription drug prices. Just for clarity, neoliberalism is an intellectual political stance that presumes the capitalist trade liberalization, the end of all state regulations on business, and indeed the end of all state-run business, will lead inevitably to market growth and thus to optimal social ends. As has now been amply documented, neoliberalism took hold across the globe over the last 2 generations. Globally, neoliberal policies forced the privatization of state-run utilities and services and withdrew support for independent labor organizations, unions, thus backpedaling from welfare state provisions and regulations that ameliorated the naked operations of capital and provided widespread social safety nets. In the global South, neoliberal ideology was implemented through the World Bank/International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs that demanded that states denationalize industries, end protectionist policies that had safeguarded native industries, open their markets to international trade, and ruthlessly cut back social programs. Despite the immense social suffering resulting from its implementation, neoliberal ideology gained enormous purchase worldwide through its celebration of rapid technological change, through the spectacle of new cornucopias of globally traded goods and individualized consumption, furthering the commodification of identity that Marx first analyzed, and through fake populist rebellions against, quote, useless government bureaucracies, which we are now seeing flow from the Heritage Foundation and the White House. And by the way, those scholars who have taken Trump's protectionist salvos as the death of neoliberalism were awfully premature, weren't they? But we, of course, also need to note that Trump's embrace melds neoliberalism to elements of fascism in new and appalling ways, as in his emulation of dictators like Orban, Erdogan, and Modi, and his plans for deportation camps. But also, we were living in a growing Dickensian reality, the best and worst of times. We saw the surprising and hopeful development of a genuinely syncretic, international progressive counterpublic sphere, comprising left-leaning labor, women's, LGBTQ, racial/indigenous civil rights, and environmental movements. In the United States, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March Pride Organizing, AAPI, and Latino activism, environmental groups, and the revitalized union movement are all elements of this ongoing phenomenon. And these ideological shifts had on-the-ground consequences, as we saw in the United States, for example, where a formerly moderate Democratic politician spearheaded the largest labor rights legislation and policy shift since the FDR and Great Depression, along with starkly new environmental, anti-racist, women's rights, and pro-LGBTQ policies, which he never got any credit for, damn it. There is now, despite horrible setbacks, a global vision of freedom, equality, and environmental justice that we can fight to enact everywhere. These contemporary movements for rights and liberation all had their own instructive back histories. Indeed, both untrammeled capitalist exploitation and widespread popular resistance have returned in the 21st century, for their second high wire act. No time for details here, but suffice it to say that the first wave of resistance across the 19th and early 20th centuries led to the establishment of the first welfare states and union mobilizations, ameliorating the human misery that untrammeled capitalism creates. As well, the global franchise expanded as women, race minority populations, and others gained access to the vote. Keynesian economic theory, with its focus on the necessity of state stimulation of the economy and the key importance of mass consumption, strengthened towards the mid-20th century as Fordism took hold across industrialized states. That virtuous cycle, as Robert Reich names it, ended in the 1970s as Fordism took hold in industrialized states. As Fordism lost ideological power with the coming of stagflation. The era of limits ushered in neoliberal shifts across the globe, and poverty populations exploded. Analyzing these extraordinarily complex global phenomena requires updating our interdisciplinary theoretical and analytic tools. Left feminist and anti-racist political economic scholars have redressed these lacunae through reframing our political economic theory to account for gender, sexuality, and race. Left feminists have articulated an expanded definition of social reproduction to include the labor necessary to keep households and communities functioning and to allow them to send productive members out into the world to work, thus incorporating all unpaid and paid women's labor into our comprehension of the larger economy. Thus, Trump and company are now enacting neoliberal cutbacks on all the surprisingly progressive anti-neoliberal policies Biden put in place, while simultaneously playing the fascist race and gender card. Pre-existing progressive counterpublics are the tip of the spear to counter this fascist menace. The Black radio show I studied for 14 years, the Tom Joyner Morning Show, constituted one such counterpublic, mobilizing working and middle-class Black Americans for progressive change. In fact, there's a good case to be made that Obama would not have won without their extraordinary support. And weirdly, positive popular response to the recent killing of the United Healthcare CEO, as historian Heather Cox Richardson has noted, indicates another structural instability and the possibility of new mobilizing on class terms. And indeed, the unhinged MAGA response to Elon Musk's defense of H-1B visas for skilled workers also reveals cracks in the MAGA foundation for us to exploit. In sum, our current situation is just as horrific as everyone imagines. The anticipatory compliance of media barons, politicians, and corporations has been sickening and dispiriting. On the other hand, yay, Costco. And the rise of formerly unimaginable wealth disparities that the tech and finance sectors have enabled has worsened the situation in every way. But I maintain Antonio Gramsci's dictum that we must engage in the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will. Or, as Samuel Beckett put it succinctly, I can't go on, I'll go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Micaela. And last but not least, we are gonna hear from Fred.
Okay, can everybody see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll second or third or fourth the thanks that everybody said for participating in this event. It's kind of a thrill for me. I'm going to run through quickly a paper and then thoughts that actually started with an election in Virginia in 1982. So I'm the old man here. I published this essay in 2003, used it in course 8, my American culture course, but didn't really start thinking about it until kind of recently. Had a conversation with Jonathan Friedman maybe 15 years ago that added something to it. And then in 2016, I realized with the Trump phenomena that I had to see, was I making any sense out of the current conditions or not? And making sense out of what's going on is the point to all of this. Okay, first of all, Trump's been around for a long time, creating havoc. I think this shot is from 2011 or thereabouts. So he's planting doubt and ambiguity in the center of American society. Um, I was really drawn in initial inspiration from something Levi-Strauss wrote long ago, where he said maybe our political stuff is like myth and religion, or what we thought myth and religion was in non-Western societies. And this paper was, in a sense, designed to explore that. There were initially three parts, the second part having two sections to it. The first thing was running through stuff about nature and culture. One of the points being that presidential candidates, sort of epitomizing election structure in the United States, they tend to try to identify themselves with a kind of nature, and the few presidential people who have come to represent nature in America. Um, and then after that, I look at our elections as rites of passage, and then added to that, thinking about that structure in terms of something about joking relationships from an old paper by Tom Beitelman. All of that was sort of fitting together by the late 1980s, and then I realized I hadn't quite figured out what do our elections do rather than being sort of installation rights, which they are certainly that. They have to do with the passing of generations. Um, but then was the realization that maybe they had to do with moving, if you will, the American mind from one set of complicated institutional realities to another. And what I did was put together um, um, visions of organic and mechanical solidarities. Before I go back to that, though, just let me point out is that if most candidates tried to identify themselves with somebody like George Washington or Abe Lincoln or whatever, especially in the 2024 election, Trump went straight to Jesus. So he makes himself like Jesus, and then he ends up, as is always the case in the inaugurations, an attempt to portray himself with all of his real connections. And you see his real connections there on the right. Now, this is the a model I created, the structure of our categories from Tom Beitelman's analysis of East African ritual structure. Um, what's behind Beitelman's take is that social systems have to have forms of order. And, in a classical structuralist thing, these are binary oppositions that are always mediated. Over any sort of time, however, um, the order breaks down, and people have to have some mechanism for reconstituting those systems. And that's often done with liminal characters who themselves are confusions of categories. One fights fire with fire. And, listening to other people and thinking about this presentation, it occurred to me is that a hypothesis for the moment is that the biggest confusion, or a big confusion facing us right now, is the passing of the hegemonic world order from North America to perhaps East Asia. And therefore, is Trump the chosen one facilitating the relative eclipse of US hegemony? I have Chinese friends who kind of chuckle with Trump because they realize he's incompetent. And it's maybe for them not bad to have a really incompetent person running the United States. This is a brief description of a sort of model of our realities. And one of them is a Durkheimian or Parsonian view of our social system, our economic system, that it's all organic solidarity. Um, but there's a certain sense in which we represent it in terms of organical stuff. When I had that phrase in, the thing that struck me is that our educational system is just the opposite. We sort of want people to start at the same, but our educational system is not designed to make them the same at the end. It's designed to make them different. So they become agencies for organic complementarities. The political system takes all those quote unquote economic differences and meshes them into a one person, one vote thing that ultimately is supposed to justify the state. All of that sort of worked to me, and then 2016 came, and it was late 2015 or early 2016 when I realized Trump is kind of interesting, and what is that? So I had to try to figure out how to place him. And, one of the first things I realized is that he's in a long line of American con men. So I spent about 6 months reading the literature on Buffalo Bill and all of these guys, and it was actually kind of fun. And I'll elaborate this maybe in my second 10 minutes, but um, an essay by Russell Baker reviewing a bunch of books on this was very striking. This is designed for the post 9/11 thing, and he's aiming this at Bush, but it really works for Trump. The man who dazzled our great-great-grandparents 125 years ago was not the romantic frontiersman they took him to be, but a brilliant entertainer who played a frontiersman in a Wild West show, assisted by an ingenious producer, a dime novelist, and a shrewd public relations man. These are all characters that surrounded the Bush family and administrations and then merged into Fox News. Cody built a fictional hero named Buffalo Bill, moved into it, and inhabited it until he became the embodiment of the fiction, a make-believe hero who enchanted millions. No wonder Americans still cling to him. We don't now, but you can take the point. As Buffalo Bill, he introduced a new stage of mass entertainment, which often seemed to be developing into an age of total entertainment. Is there a more relevant historical figure for a nation that marches off to a televised war promising an audience of spectacle, of shock and awe? And the answer to that is yes, it's Donald Trump. And I believe we have to understand the realization of that character, the showmanship stuff, in terms of the intensification of class hierarchies, again, on the march radically since about 1980. And if I get time at the end, I will come back to the sort of subtitles here. William and Cody, I mentioned that. Camp meetings, Southern camp meetings, and then schismogenesis and its deflections. That gets to another sociological and historical component to the present. I'll leave my presentation at that. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of the speakers for keeping with time. Um, if Fred can stop sharing, we're going to start the second round of comments. And we're again going to start with Carolyn Rouse to either respond or expand on her initial comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed everybody's talk. I am struggling, however, because I'm finding concepts like neoliberalism or allyship or Latino or union, like I'm finding all of that stuff breaking down in my field at my field site. And, one of the things that is interesting to me is, first of all, I work with poor whites, and I often do this because generational wealth means that they own a house, which is a big deal. It's a double wide trailer, it's a small house, whatever, they own it outright, which means all of their Social Security disability goes to them and not to paying rent. So they are a strange sort of combination. And they're committed to a kind of a libertarianism, no government, small government. They're products of Reagan. And so the thing that they feel like pushed them down and that was unfair was affirmative action. And that, the government just needs to get out. And if you just get the government out, then, the cream will rise to the top. Of course, they think they'll be the cream. And so they hate the government, which is why they, hate healthcare, the Obamacare, and think that a free market system will just produce a kind of a meritocracy. So, it's all magical thinking inspired by neoliberal economic theories and all the rest. But one thing that they are okay with is gamification. And so when we talk about neoliberalism, I'm always struck by it is a kind of explanatory model. We're not really talking about how people feel, like what it because I don't think people feel like they live in a neoliberal, oppressive society. They just feel what they feel in their life, and they have a lot of pride, and they talk about how they love their community and they love their lives, and they don't need a lot of wealth. And I think one thing that progressives also make a mistake about is that money doesn't equal value. We need enough money to be secure. We need security, but money itself doesn't necessarily make somebody happier or necessarily should be the measure of an equal society. So the one thing that they're okay with is a society where the economy is gamified. And so for me, that's the way in which I'm trying to understand their commitments to Trump and to Elon Musk and to all of that. They feel that because there's a lot of shame associated with the fact that they came from upper middle and middle class homes and fell down the economic ladder. But if they were to somehow make the right choice and invest in crypto and somehow catch it before it falls, right? A pyramid scheme, or they win the lottery or something that for them, that's just part of the game. And if they make a mistake, and they lose everything because they were on meth for 30 years, right? Or whatever, then they accept the fact that they live the way they live because they just didn't play the game right. So for me, that's become an interesting way to think about the affective aspects of neoliberalism and the rejection of government shaping a kind of redistribution model. Again, at the local level, they are purely progressive. They vote in a progressive way. They want all these progressive policies enacted that help them pay their utilities, keep the water clean, so it's a lot of things. And I'm not sure that I can use the term like neoliberalism or even allyship, because again, progressives keep thinking that, and I was, Micaela, we were emailing each other. They keep thinking that like Martin Luther King's idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not DEI, right? That became the American dream in the 60s. It was like, oh, now everybody's able to take advantage of these opportunities. That's the American dream. For many immigrants and young, the American dream is like Trump. It's like making a lot of money and being able to say fuck you to the rest of the world. That's like the American dream. That's the gamified economic system. And I want to be part of that because I think I can win the game. And so progressives keep thinking that you're appealing to one sensibility when there's a whole nother sensibility that has emerged, in this digital age and with the growth of these billionaires. And I think, so I'm trying to focus on other things. Again, I'm trying to dismantle some of the categories we've used in the 20th century to categorize and name and then quantify certain formulas or ideas or that I don't think necessarily are working anymore.
Thank you so much. So, Carolyn, you actually have 7 minutes, but so I wanted to be. That's why I was wondering whether I could ask you to explain a little bit more what you mean by the gamification of economy.
Oh, okay. I thought it was more of a conversation at this
Yeah,
point.
no, totally.
Okay,
It
so
is.
I didn't want to
Just
take up
wanted
all
to
of the
take
time.
advantage of of the time to.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would love to like get to the discussion because there's just these scholars in the room are just amazing. But so Patrick Jagoda, he's at the University of Chicago. He does this wonderful job of talking about games and how games sort of are used. You can use them to mimic the world, and people use them to quote unquote, get people to rethink things. And it's a really interesting way of reconsidering how we think about rewards in society, whether we deserve them or not, and then how we take advantage of them or not. And the ethics behind them or not. And so I've just been kind of digging into this because it maps so cleanly onto the kind of conversations I had. And these people are like, you would not call them necessarily racist. You would not call them they're not, I don't think they're going to join any genocidal movements. There are some like libertarians and there are some racist. And I have a postdoc who talks to them and I just don't even bother talking to them. And my experience in the field is different than hers. And people who I know, I mean, they're radical Trump supporters and they're white men and they're like my good friends, right? So like it complicates the kind of, if you're for Trump, you're for white supremacy. Also, I think anthropologists in particular have to push back against the people keep saying, oh, it's going to be a minority majority country in 2040. That is claiming that if you're Latino, it's an essential category that carries throughout your generationally. You never let go of that. That's like saying the Irish Americans who came 60 years ago they're not, right? Are they still a minority? 100 years ago, are they still a minority? Why do we think that just because you're Latino that you're a minority for generationally? White people, Latinos who are light skinned, they become white like generationally. It's not there. So this whole idea of minority majority country is itself a racist construct. And so I think that like people on the ground in California, they say a lot of things. They may vote in the abstract, the way, yes, I mean, voting is myth and ritual. And it is this is a symbolic head. This is an abstract symbolic head, right? But it's not the way in which they want their everyday lives to be run. There was something about Trump, eggs. They kept saying the price of eggs. And then I would joke with them because nothing else, the price of gas was the same as it was before, right? Nothing really had changed. All of those were just excuses to vote for Trump. The inflation wasn't the issue. Biden's administration have childhood poverty rate, right? There was so much evidence that this was not, that was just an excuse. And right-wing media and progressive mainstream, the New York Times is really guilty of a lot. And then, so again, I'm pushing towards this idea that the way in which we've constructed notions of categories and objectivity are really kicking us in the butt. And the New York Times is an example. And I was listening, Jon Stewart came and spoke, and he arrogantly said that journalists should be advocates and should be doing sort of progressive politics. And I think they do this terribly. And even try to pushing Biden out of the election. I don't really care, I mean, it's at one level, I think it would have been great if he just let it go earlier. But why did they think? That goes back to the entertainment value. I don't think of a politician, a government official, as needing to be entertainment. Going back to Cody, and yet even progressives said his entertainment value isn't good enough. And so he should step off the stage when his administrative capabilities were still clear. He was still doing that work despite all of the bluster in the media. And, and again, another excuse is trans rights when nobody really knows what that is. And it's like 0.0001, or 0%. And it's not actually affecting your life, but they could turn anything into an excuse to vote for Trump because he represents the American dream at this point is how I feel, which I don't like, but it's how I feel. So.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was amazing. All right, so we're moving to Alex.
Yeah. Anyways, pick up a few different things, to just underscore with Carolyn that there's a real danger to slipping into these abstract categories that are race complexities on the ground. Anthropologists especially should be aware of that. And that is certainly true with MAGA. and with Trump voters. You know, anyways, I want to sort of jump ahead, in terms of thinking about reification, because that's effectively, that's when Adorno's version of it. It was the paradox of thinking is that we have to reify, we have to categorize, but it's always like going back and questioning those categories and sort of breaking them down. But of course, it's hard to do because you can't, every time you're saying something and using any type of conceptual abstraction, you're slipping into it. So that's sort of the paradox. And so we sort of go, lean towards and into reifications too often. A couple other shifts. One I didn't mention in terms of 1.0 and 2.0 is that there is more Christian nationalism. And again, what is it? We can dive into it. Is definitely more of a force, I think, this time, in part, no small part due to Turning Point, which has had an extraordinary influence. When Kirk went around and did the "I'll take all of you on campuses," that was all sorts of people were seeing those videos. And again, he helped galvanize younger voters. Anyone who's been to a Turning Point event will sort of know the fervency that you see. And that was one thing. So there's sort of different levels, right? There's sort of what is the reality. So if we talk about something like inflation, what's the reality? And we can argue about that reality and how it affects people. And then there's the way that it's packaged conceptually in a political message. And I think in that regard, I agree with Carolyn that the messaging, although maybe she wouldn't phrase it quite this way, the messaging of Trump through MAGA, which became MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, at the end of his rallies that I went to, they were saying MA, blank, great again, all sorts of different things. They slip it in. It's this package you can weave virtually anything to, and does very much stand for the American dream. And so here we're at the moment where the American dream has begun on day one. And of course, as we said, as we can already see with some of those tensions, there's a tension between the quote unquote oligarchs, as they're being abstractly called, and the populists with Bannon and Musk that already broke in. And that one's headed for a train wreck. When I was at a recent far right event in December, everyone was saying, "Oh, it's great to have Musk," and then suddenly 3 weeks later, it had split. So, but what worries me again is that what's going to happen when you begin to have division and failures and the promises, which can never, of course, it's like back to Derrida, right? It's always to come. It's never to be attained. It falls, slippage. Well, then you blame people, and that's what I'm worried about during the administration. For those who may not be as familiar with Orban and the different things he did, right? So, the sort of analogies through populism, right, is one big stream. He came in and he began to gut the judiciary, the media, civil society. Soros, of course, came under attack. Education, which we actually haven't talked about, because the domain in which I assume virtually all of us perhaps are involved in are a prime target, and stuff is going to be coming our way. It already has been, but it's going to come in a much different way. So anyone who's read Project 2025, chapter on education, some of the stuff's already in motion, but there's a freight train coming towards education in general. But again, if it's executive orders, there are lawsuits, things go on. So how effective it will be, time will tell. The sort of Christian nationalist identity politics aimed in particular against immigrants. That's something that seems to be much more aligned. I don't know. I have no insight into the mind of Donald Trump, but I really think the assassination and the way he speaks about it at his rallies and in general, where he turned his head, he'll mention, and here's the graphic that was up, it was actually about immigration. I think there's this way in which some of what the different pastors and Christian nationalists and other evangelical Christian groups who may not sort of push for that, what is Christian nationalism, sort of an alignment between Christianity and the nation, to what degree, how does it link into history? If we start to break that down. But a number of groups, I think, were pushing him the first time and now have more influence, including Charlie Kirk as one of them. Crony capitalism in Hungary, again, is another thing. Politics of fear and grievance. Um, and Trump himself has said, he's met with Orban, says he's a great leader. And the head of Heritage has also made a comment that, the US can learn from the Hungarian model. And so I think this is not just sort of abstract out there. I think it's something that people are very aware of. CPAC has actually held, well, the last CPAC, the theme was where globalism goes to dies. And there were all sorts of far right figures, government leaders from all over the world who had come in, and they're all interacting, communicating. And CPAC is actually held in other countries. It was in Japan recently. Every year for the past couple of years, Orban spoke at it at one point. But there's a sort of ecosystem that usually people aren't that aware of that exists in communication. So it's the Hungarian model. Another thing we haven't really talked about is the social media or social information ecologies, which have shifted from 1.0 to 2.2. We talk about Fox News. Who's watching Fox? Some people are watching Fox. A lot of people aren't watching Fox. They're getting their news, especially younger kids, in all sorts of different places. And this is where the YouTubers, when I was at this December far right event, they had different YouTubers who were on there and had a live YouTuber sort of event that several thousand people observed. So that's another big shift. And I think Democrats are very far behind on that, even as obviously that's something they could catch up on. Um, you know, I don't know. Do I have like 2 minutes left? Yeah. Sort of what can people do? And again, this is both on the left and the right, but we have that cliche, and part of this comes from attending, doing my ethnographic research with depolarization groups. Um, but the people have real hesitation. It's almost a cliche to say to break out of your bubble, but people's information is really kind of siloed in many different ways. And it takes an active effort to go out and listen to stuff that often people will find unpleasant, right? Because it represents a very different point of view. But if we're back to when Carolyn was mentioning, you have to talk to people. People are complicated. They may vote in one way, but they're complex human beings. And you can't just say, oh, it's a MAGA crazy person, or, the one that bugs them a lot, a racist. Even that, I think, has now shifted. And 1.0 to 2.0, it's being co-opted and talked about a different way. But that really burned a lot of people, burned them up to hear the racism accusation. And again, it's a reification that dismisses complexity, even to say, of course, we have histories, right, of white power extremism, white supremacy in the US that have to be attended to. But it's very too easy to sort of just dismiss people. One thing that's been of interest in this depolarization research is a lot of the work is very ethnographic in the sense that what do? Well, you go and listen. You don't jump in and tell people your opinion. You just sit there and you listen and you hear and you bite your tongue. You may have very different opinions. I did, my perpetrator research in Cambodia when I talked to former torturers, people who engaged in mass murder. I didn't sit there and argue with them or tell them what I thought. I just listened. And I'm not trying to make a direct analogy between Trump supporters and, people I interviewed in Cambodia. But I'm saying methodologically, because that's where I come from my ethnographic research, it's the same tool, but listening, and it's hard to do. Avoiding ticket thinking, which is another Adorno concept, which is where we just sort of, oh, I'm a Democrat or a Libertarian or a Republican, therefore I adopt and defend the platform, all of it as it is. That's real slippage. And if someone goes against it, they're going against orthodoxy. Well, we're gonna get that person. That can also be sort of a groupthink thing to avoid that and to question the reifications. Another thing that, at least for me, I've been trying to do is the ways that we speak and discourse are often so far removed from the interest or familiarity with vernaculars of theory. It's like, what percentage of the US is illiterate? I think it's about 20%. Half of the US reads at sixth grade or under level. So if we want to communicate, this is actually what with trade books and with public platform articles, they say, pitch it to a smart seventh grader. Right? So a smart seventh grader can understand it. We don't teach, at least when I was a student, we don't teach people creative writing tools. In the past, nobody, certainly when I was in graduate school, nobody mentioned writing an op-ed or how you write it. The model was you look at what's being written, you kind of imitate it, and you go on. Now, of course, there's variation in programs, but I think for anthropologists, if we want to engage in the public sphere and bring insights, it's not like people are going to come running to you. You have to engage with them in a way where you can communicate. And I think that's a big problem. Um, yeah, I think I'm probably up with my time. One little aside with Kash Patel coming up. You may know that Kash Patel is the one who produced the J6 choir singing the anthem that was first went on at Waco, where it's cross-cut with Trump doing the Pledge of Allegiance. As sort of an aside saying, go back to 2023 and everything that's happening now is sort of like you just see it all. But again, may not know it, but Trump's first campaign stop was Waco. And that's when they played that anthem of the J6 choir, which was produced by Kash Patel. And we'll see what happens when it goes up. Anyways, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Alex. All right, we're going to go to Micaela.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for their very insightful talks. And then also a point of clarification here. I'm going to show my age and reference a very, very old ad, the Certs ad. Certs is a candy mint, Certs is a breath mint, and the guy comes in and says, "Stop, you're both right." I really appreciate both Carolyn's and Alex's deep ethnographic engagement with the MAGAverse, with people in their own homes, with people at these conferences, etc. It's work I could not do, and I cherish your bravery and your empathetic ethnography. That doesn't mean that we abandon concepts, analytic concepts that allow us to understand reality. We certainly need better means of communicating realities to people beyond the academy, but we want to do both. And in my own work, I've focused on progressive counterpublics and their sometime successes. And in order to talk about that affect, as Carolyn talks about, I'm going to go back to the Tom Joyner Morning Show and how they approached Trump 1.0. Like most of us, show anchors assumed that Clinton would win because of Trump's manifest absurdity as a candidate, and because all the polls indicated that. The show covered the campaigns with absolute outrage over Trump and company's many appalling lies and overt racism and misogyny. Very early on, they began coining disrespectful, comically accurate epithets for him. Huggy Lowdown, a DC-based comic who joined the show about a decade ago, played a lounge lizard who commented mostly on celebrity scandals. But Huggy became so outraged over Trump that within a short period of time, he became a political operative. And his list of nasty, hilarious Trump epithets just kept growing and were funnier than ever after Trump was elected, because we were all so miserably in need of comic relief. Here are the best. Trumple Thinskin. The orange dude is all kinds of rude. The pig pen of politics. Flatulent with a comb over. The pumpkin-colored race baiter. The billionaire bigot bozo. That orange stool sample. Putin's pistachio holder. Commander tissue shoes after he was caught by cameras with toilet paper on his shoes. And finally, the one that sets most people off, toupee fiasco. The audience texters were as witty and scathingly disdainful. One with an obvious country background wrote in one day that Trump's hair is like a chicken's ass in high wind. So those are the sorts of affects that I've been focusing on. Anger, outrage, and snark, just extraordinary humor, as a way of fighting back and ultimately shifting the discourse. Thanks. I don't think I used up 10 minutes, but that's all right.
That's great. We can just save it to the discussion at the end. Thank you so much, Micaela. And we are going to go to Fred. for this.
Okay, I may keep my comments short as well. First of all, it was striking to me how much everything that people were talking about was resonating with various things that were in my background and a draft paper I wrote for my presentation today. So it's kind of interesting. A couple of things there. At one point, I had to sort of stand back and say, an important part of our campaign system is what it used to be, and it's still called mudslinging. And Trump was actually pretty effective in that with certainly with Hillary Clinton and with Kamala Harris. The question is asked me, why does the mud never stick to Trump? And because if you will, there's so much of it. And one of the potential answers to that question for me came from the first year which is fall of 2016, when I taught my American culture course with the realization that Trump was a problem. And a section in the course dealt with the Second Great Awakening. And one of the kids wrote a really brilliant paper, seemed brilliant then, still does now, comparing Trump to early 19th century Southern preachers and the spectacle stuff that they put on. And he was right about that. And one can go on from that. But then another thing that's been sort of hitting me over and over again for the last couple of months is the fact that we're all sinners. And even if people are not really involved in organized churches, and many of Trump's adherents are, all of them know that in some sense, if you're a really good Christian, you're a sinner. So when the Democrats keep pointing out that Trump is a sinner, it's really, well, he's just like one of us. And this seems to me is to be one of the background things that has to do with, if you will, explaining where we are right now. There's another part of this order thing. If you look at the politician who's really done a lot to deal with, if you will, the real problems of state we have, which are class hierarchies and environmental things, and maybe recentering production back in the United States. Nobody has done anything compared to what Biden did. But he got absolutely no credit for that in the context of this last election and from many other Democratic people. And it's sort of interesting. It's also pathetic, but it's sort of interesting. And one of the things we have to do is to come to terms with that. Some of it's messaging, but some of it's actually, there are real realities out there. That gets to the experience of order. There is profound disorder now in the world and in the United States, and they all don't look connected, but of course, in some fashion, they are. The fires in Los Angeles are the most recent example of not just global warming, but the fact that human life is now out of conjunction with the world, and we've got to do something about that. Whether or not we will or not is unclear. Trump, of course, is axing that, all the stuff that Biden tried to do, but it's not going to disappear because he says it did. So there's a kind of reality there. The next thing I would want to add, and this is, again, how to analyze all this stuff, is after the first half of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century became really sort of interesting to me for thinking about where we are. And after the rise of religion and its ties with university systems in the 19th century, a big thing in the United States in the 19th century is, Bill Cody is one, Buffalo Bill, but it's also sports. And one of the things that's sort of interesting in terms of the cross currents here is that the fact of the matter is that while various aspects of our society are moving towards reducing the amount of skill that has to go into the productive process, sports is just the opposite. I mean, the amount of skill that's now being funneled into athletes in general and great ones in particular is just astonishing. When I was a boy, we did 3 or 4 sports. Now, if you're not specializing by the time you're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, you're not going to make it, given that you should make it sort of professionally. And it's sort of interesting that that's going on and on with all of these political things. Of course, sports is part of the entertainment business. And it's not difficult to find, especially if you live in the DC area, all the excitement that's come across with the rise of the Commanders and the football team. People are really happy. And, that's great. And there's no, one reason why it's a good team is because they're all working together really hard. So it's a sort of model for stuff. But it also takes all kinds of attention away from other things. And that's where we live now, a world deflection. And Trump figured out how to become a master at that. And, that's our problem. Anyway, I will stop there. Thanks for all of you for participating in this.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers. We have about half an hour actually for questions. So if you could just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, that would be wonderful. We also, APLA President Heath Cabot is here too, and she is going to be monitoring the chat. If you would like to write your questions in the chat as well. So that's also a way of asking questions. We have Srimati Basu. I see their hand. So if you can unmute yourself to ask.
Hi, thank you for an excellent discussion. I vaguely feel better. I think I feel better to think that other people are thinking about it in these ways. So I'm going to ask my question, I think, to several of you across this, and just boringly say the word intersectionality before it is banned. But I was wondering about, I know the numbers are not out, but I'm still wondering about, the role that race played in the election, I guess, and the combination of race and gender played in the numbers are not large in what the shifts have been, but they're not insignificant, right? And one of those, let me just contextualize this by saying, Carolyn, I loved your description of your fieldwork, because I am in my own fieldwork working on this anti-feminist group in India, and I see that same thing, that there is a problem that's named, and there is a sort of alignment with other sorts of discourses, right? But as a person who's an immigrant to the US, who grew up in South Asia, and is an anthropologist of South Asia. One of the reasons this is the US scenario is really resonant is that also in a kind of a fascist state in India, immigration is mobilized as a divisive thing in a way that aligns across classes. It attaches both to immigration and hence to Islam. So I agree that among South Asians in the US, right, you see that thing that Carolyn talked about, right, that people do not carry that burden of we are people of color anymore. I gather from all data, South Asians, for example, vote overwhelmingly Democrat because I think they're afraid that, what I gather from scholars is that I gather that they think Republicans are more racist, but they see themselves as part of the politics of whatever we're calling neoliberalism, or so just any of that, immigration, race, gender, Harris, but Trump.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, or shall we turn to the panelists for their response?
So I like to be very generous. I'm a Black scholar, and I don't want to be pigeonholed as only having to study Black people. There's a politics to me studying white folks as well, and I want to do it generously, right? And I want to be open. But racism is a thing. I mean, I think the reason why Democrats didn't show up, which is the bigger issue to vote for Harris, is because of racism and classism. And that's a shame. And that's partly why I don't necessarily trust people who claim progressive values, because I'm not sure what their commitments are. And so anyway, but I'll say no more.
And let me just add here that I wanted to say that, as a person from India and a person from South Asia more generally, there is no dearth of women leaders in politics, and there's no dearth of horribly oppressive women leaders, right? So this idea that the US cannot come around to the idea that there could be a woman president just seems mystifying.
Yeah, for
Would any other speakers like to comment?
yeah, I might just go in. I still will go back to turnout and inflation, and maybe Carolyn and I disagree a tiny bit on the inflation thing. But the other thing I think of the sort of the meat and potatoes, immigration, and I think for those of us who, I'm in the New York metro area who live in the cities, it was striking when Texas started sending people to Chicago, New York, other cities, that you really had a discursive shift and a new sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, including from different people of color, immigrants community, especially when there were budget shortfalls like in New York City. There was a lot of resentment that built up around that issue. And I think, again, if you look at the shifts, urban areas swung towards Trump as well. I mean, it was virtually every category shifted towards Trump. So that was another issue. And, sort of just going back to messaging, I can't underscore it enough of going to a Harris rally and then going to a Trump rally, the just focus, laser focus, and the ability to weave everything in. It was like night and day in terms of it. And it's part of the problem with Democrats. It's a really big tent, a lot of issues, and some of the successes are kind of nitty gritty, and they can't go up against a message like MAGA. And so that's part of the challenge for Democrats is to get a message that's effective. So I've seen Vance speak, obviously Trump, and people will say it's sort of set up. My own view is that there is no Trump besides Trump, and once he goes, the charisma goes. And so in 4 years, my worry is mainly that we're going to have a situation where, let's say, Laura Trump is running for president, and we have a contested election. I think we're right back at the potential for political violence and potential scenarios at that point. But anyways, sorry. No, you said you were feeling good, so I figured I'd throw in something to make us all feel bad, right? That's a worry for 2024. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. Hey, Heath has some, I think, questions from the chat, and then we're going to go to Hayden Matthew, who raised his hand.
Great. Yeah, there are a few. Thanks, everyone. I have my own questions, but I will hold them. Just a few of the questions or in comments from the chat. There was a comment earlier that I'm just going to distill down to the following question, and I'm going to put about 3 questions out right now, and I think it's okay to pick and choose if and how you want to respond. One question was, how do you reckon the sort of call, which I think we're all anthropologists, I think we're sympathetic to the call to recognize the complexity, right? To that people live beyond categories and the importance of listening, as Alex was talking about. So how do you resolve that with what was earlier described in the chat as really a very violent and an intention to harm others, right? Like this sort of hate, not just rhetoric of hate, but actual hate. And I think I'm trying to look for it earlier. It was Nick BR talking about how he was really having a hard time understanding how his family and friends were actually voting for a platform that had so much hate in it. So that was one question. The next one comes from Pinky Hota, which is about the role of Christianity and Christian nationalism. And it was an invitation to the speakers to speak to that as well. And then finally, and then I'll, we've got a couple more comments. The role of mis and disinformation and the importance of the outlook of Trump. Sorry. Um, the role of mis and disinformation in shaping the outlook of Trump supporters, and how is this? Can we think about that also in terms of voter suppression in a wider framework? Maybe I should read this actually. Sorry. Yes. Um, we've covered so much about mis and disinformation and shaping and the importance of the outlook of Trump supporters. How much is explained by this in the balance with voter suppression in all its manifestations? And there's a very, I think, extensive analysis here by Michael Lockett, which maybe I could just read. In terms of looking forward, there were thoughts leading up to the 2016 election where both the Republicans and the independents behind Bernie were discussing the brokenness of America and the need to burn it down, which I also take to be on the right and the left or across the political spectrum. And we're having similar kinds of, hearing similar kinds of calls. The caveat, though, is that many on the left realize that if the U.S. does not address its original and continuing sins of the genocide of Native Americans and and the enslavement of the peoples of African descent, we will not actually fix anything. What do you think? And if you could, I think, and if you could couch your answers in what Germany partially did in dealing with Hitler and the Nazis. So I guess an invitation to think historically in that sense. Okay, so I realize those are a number of questions from the chat, and so, but yeah, I think.
Can I answer to respond to Michael's first? So I work in an area where there are a number of indigenous groups, and in fact, until just this month, 2 of the 5 county board of supervisors were Homo. So they were. It's a very integrated in sense of sovereignty and legislative sort of power, and it's been beautiful for, they're working together. There are some tensions, but the 2% of Black folks who live in Lake County are poorer than the indigenous groups. So they've got casinos. They also kick people off the rolls. So they're invested in capitalism too. And so I'm writing about the original sin. Absolutely. This is their commitments to a cruel form of capitalism where a certain part of the population is expendable for labor and for death is very much a part of the history of that county. Brutal, horrific diaries of genocide in the mid-19th century that sets the stage for the development of this county. So absolutely right about it. And then all of the covenants, land covenants in California that restricted land ownership. So Black people couldn't even own land. And so white people are buying up all of this land and then they're giving it up to their children, or it's part of their inheritance. And you look back before 1965 and their parents who were often alcoholics and substance abusers and violent, they maintained their middle-class jobs because immigrants, Black people and women weren't really allowed in the workforce. So they've inherited a lot of the original sin, right? And so that's why this is also a really interesting field site for me. And so they collect a lot of stuff. I'm not going to call them hoarders. Because their private property is so, like, white people, they feel like their stuff is an extension of their power, right? Your property line is yours, and Black people have never felt that way. You can be Black and drive a Mercedes and you'll be pulled over by the police. It doesn't matter. They'll disconnect you from your wealth and from your status. White people, their property, their boats, their white limousines, whatever, is an extension of themselves and their status. So their commitments to stuff, to things, remains. And so they have so much stuff that code enforcement has finally said, we're done with this. And we went and we saw all of the tax default. We looked at the tax default map. It's extraordinary. All these white folks who own their property were not paying taxes, and the city was just like led by libertarians, state of Jefferson folks. They were just letting them go.
Wow.
And the city, so just recently the city said, we're done with that, this county. Now they're taking people's property, they're code enforcement. So that's why I'm making this film about code enforcement. It's this attempt to take money to start, saying, no, you have rights and duties. You're part of a community. It's not just you by yourself, and investing it in forms of care, behavioral health. Recently, they just voted for a new health to develop their hospitals, land management because of the fires, all of this care stuff. And so for me, that's been an interesting transition from what I call an economy of things to an economy of care. And it's absolutely like dealing with the fact that this original sin doesn't actually work. And yes, they would have been Bernie vote. Many people said in 2016, when I started before Trump was elected, they said they wanted to vote for Bernie, not for Trump. So yes, it was a burn it all down. So they have now the burn it all down politician, and at the local level, the Bernie people, right? The people who are actually making, as local politicians, actually making the kind of changes that Bernie Sanders will actually make. So in a sense, they're kind of got both. They're not really Christian. They don't really go to church. Sorry, Pinky. And I've already talked about misinformation. Yes, it's a way of voter suppression. Absolutely.
Thank you. Any other speakers before I move to Hayden's question?
I guess I could jump in on a couple of the other pieces. So yeah, again, if we go to the hate issue, so again, if you get into the MAGAverse, if you will, it's actually people on the left who are the haters. So it's this, like, one thing that struck me, and one of the first times I went to a CPAC, was the fact that on the one side, there was the fear of the authoritarian, fascist, evil tyrant Trump. And on the other side, it was the fear of the Marxist, radical left, socialist, and both sides were saying it's the apocalypse. It's the end of democracy. Like, literally mirror discourses. And if people are not sort of connecting into these alternative bubbles, silos, and information flows. I mean, this isn't like one or two people. This is a predominant discourse that continues into the present and is informing what's going on. But the idea was it was actually people on the left who were the haters. And then they would talk about things like now the term, it's interesting to be in this space over time, and you see how the term lawfare, nobody knows about it. And you see it begins to get worked, it comes out, and suddenly everybody knows about the term. Replacement was actually like that as well. But the whole narrative, going back to Waco, is that, in fact, the Democrats are a bunch of haters. They're evil. They persecuted Trump and his followers. In terms of hate speech, he was slandered by them. So, the question's aimed in one sense at the rhetorics of hate, which is all legitimate. But the same there are these mirror discourses that exist, and we get into information and misinformation. So, at this recent one I went to, people brought up the Wall Street Journal report that Biden maybe it made it to some extent into a more moderate to left-leaning media spaces, but the Wall Street Journal, which leans not the opinion, which leans much more to the right, but the news part of it's more in the center, did a thing saying that Biden was basically being protected. And so the rhetoric is, well, look at all these stupid Democrats. They were fooled, they were tricked, they were manipulated by people in their party, and this is where they ended up. So you have the discourses, and the question is, well, what's the reality? Well, clearly Trump, lies constantly and frequently, but the perception is of misinformation and disinformation is that it's, each side sees the other one as doing it a lot. Hunter Biden's laptop, which did come out in Fox and other right-wing media sources during the 2020 election, was not mentioned at all by CNN and other MSNBC. And it's actually true because I was watching like Carolyn, I guess, and maybe, I don't know, the rest of my colleagues watching Fox, and you saw it going on. And so they'll point to that and say, look, it was quashed by the deep state. So that's part of the difficulty, sort of getting in, is to see how things can be perceived in very different ways, in ways that are very contradictory to the way we may see things, or one of us may see things. And I'll just end with the Bernie thing. The second part of the question, my book, It Can Happen Here, traces all that, the history and goes into that. But so if you want to go to the last AmFest, Turning Point USA, in December 19th, 20th, something like that, they had a progressive left-wing blogger who had a dialogue with Charlie Kirk. He is, well, he's been called a Christian nationalist, but he certainly is religious. He would deny that term, I think. He's very religious, a big Trump supporter. And they had a dialogue, and they were basically like, oh yeah, going back to this theme, you're a bunch of fools. Bernie had the message, and you were tricked. The Democrats manipulated the system because they're deep state evil, blah, 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 all those terms. And they basically pushed Bernie out, and he actually had the message that Trump has. And if you just kept the message, you wouldn't be at this point. And so this progressive left-wing YouTuber and Charlie Kirk agreed on that point. Anyway, so it's, part of really going into this space deeply is you find things that never would have occurred to you, being said, that make you then, as in anthropology, you step back and you look at things again. Well, what about Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020? Shouldn't people have spoken about it? And what about Bernie Sanders? Though I assume a number of people here might already sort of agree with that point of view with Bernie.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Hayden Matthew to ask his question. He's been waiting really patiently.
Hi, thank you. Just a little background on myself. I'm a college student at California, CSU Monterey Bay, and I'm 22 years old. And I have a background where I grew up with social media as it was growing. And I think for me, I'm an anthropology concentration, and I think that for me, when I saw this last election cycle, social media played a bigger role than anything. And I wonder, I know Hinton, you mentioned social media a few times, YouTube, and those YouTubers you saw from those rallies. Like, I know who those people are because I've grown up with them as well. So I wonder, what do you guys think is the next steps to, trying to understand how social media plays a role now as compared to what it used to, and where it goes in the future?
Thank you, Hayden. Would anyone like to take this question?
Oh, when I say Fox, I only mean in the sense that oftentimes social media people will pick up and echo what Fox says, but like they are on message. And I think that Fox dominates. I think Fox dominates MSNBC too, because they're always reactive to whatever Fox is saying, as opposed to going out and changing the narrative and focusing on other things. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, people kept talking about Elon Musk's odd ticks and not talking about the fact that people just lost a reduced prescription medication, right? And so, like, even MSNBC, like it's reactive, and social media does the same thing. It's reactive, and that's why I don't. Journalists who say they're objective, I don't know what that means. I think they're sucked into a kind of a hall of mirrors, and that very little original stuff is coming out of any of it. So social media is plays a huge role.
I often play the role of being the outsider or the negative person and stuff. I'm not convinced social media is all as important as the ideological structures that are governing our lives. When I was reading about campaigns in the 19th century, you know, there were guys who would give 3-day orations that everybody listened to. Everybody being, of course, a much smaller percentage of people than we have today. So. You know, I'm not sure the media is the message. I think it's the message is the message, and it's the structure of the system. Um, and we're not going to get outside of our culture, so I'm not sure there's an alternative there other than to keep fighting. But I think it would be my perspective is that we're paying too much attention to the media per se. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I think the system is absolutely critical in sort of tracing the flows and the production of media itself is, you know, when YouTubers are getting a message, it depends on the one, but it's not as if they're kind of randomly get it. There's a whole system that's set up to produce messages. And, you know, this is a sort of, you know, from my stream of research on replacement discourse, you can actually go into forums like 4chan, and you can see how things that are said there percolate and are tested and gone back up. What Trump also does is I mean, this is his strategy, is he starts saying something, he tests it, sees what sticks. They pick up something, they go with it. He's constantly throwing things out there to see what's going to happen. But there is a sort of explicit packaging that goes on. So if you go to CPAC, there's no dialogue. It's a message. There's a theme. People come in, they speak for 20 minutes, crystal clear. Everything's highly produced. You have many of the grassroots activists in there, conservatives. They do not have YouTubers there. Maybe they'll start getting them. But I'd just say, but more broadly, if you just look at the numbers of people watching news channels, it's way down. Far more people get their information from these alternative, no, they're not alternative, from these other ecosystems, you know, TikTok, YouTubers, and YouTubers actually because it's a bunch of people sitting around having a conversation in this kind of loose way often, or sometimes it's a one-on-one. It's not choreographed in the way that media discussions are. And it's entertaining. It's interesting in a way that news often is not. But I'm sure for those of us who have children, talk to people in classrooms, what have you, the news is coming and radically. If I ask my students how many of you read the New York Times or a newspaper, I might get one or two hands going up in a class, maybe three. They're all getting it from social media. That's not to say it's not linked to the system, because of course you have this messaging. But and anyways, for those, you know, in terms of Democrats, it's clear they're far behind on this. But we'll see what happens by the next election. Donald Trump Jr. is a podcaster and he speaks like one. And I don't think he'll run for president, but it's interesting that he discusses, he uses a lot of the vernaculars. I'm just keep trying to think, Trumpism dies with Trump, who could step in? And I don't really see anyone. It's not J.D. Vance. I don't think it's Trump Jr. Anyways, so that's the bright spot for those who don't like Trump is, you know, that's it for Trumpism, unless he somehow tries to go again. So with regard to the question, what will kill Trumpism? Trumpism, this was asked actually in Project Syndicate, a little forum we had back in 20, 21, 22, where the question was, does Trumpism die with, you know, with Trump? And I was like, of course, Trumpism is linked to Trump. No one's going to continue. He's singular. You know, that's my perspective. You have to be charismatic, and very few politicians are nearly that charismatic. So anyways, I'll stop there.
I think we have a question in the chat. Heath, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. This is from Lieke van der Veer, who is asking in the context of the ethnographic fieldwork she does in the Netherlands, where there's a new fascist government in office with DEI policy practitioners and local government as interlocutors. And I'm just going to piggyback and say, it's funny. I mean, I'm now based in Norway. I'm from the US, but I do think I think it's interesting to put these different dilemmas in conversation also globally. If there's a type, there's sorry, among my takeaways of the conversation is that affirmative action is among the reasons why white middle classes started to hate the government, citing Carolyn Rouse, that intersectionality is taboo and that DEI will become / is banned. My question, are there emergent ways that the panelists currently observe in which progressive counterpublics anticipate this backlash in their efforts to continue to address racism and reconfigurations of whiteness? Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my research is always institutional research. I've been interested in how, like, you get doctors to sign on to try and reduce racial health disparities. But, we know from early political anthropology that when an idea is out in the public, it often flattens it, right? Politics in the dark is sometimes better than politics out in front. Like Biden got a lot done because people weren't paying, he wasn't entertaining enough, so people weren't paying attention to what he and Kamala Harris were doing. Once it gets out into the public, it becomes rather flattened and brittle. And so I think we need to go back to the kind of things that we had been doing quietly all along. And to get to where we were, we're going to have to rebuild it. And like I said, I thought, even the rigid ideas about diversity got me as a chair when I was chair. We were the most diverse department, and we had another kind of diversity we wanted, but it didn't fit the institutional category. And that really upset me, right? Because we need to be able to think about diversity in interesting ways. And I used to never look at people's diversity when they were looking at graduate admissions. It was always like, it just happens, because if you change your notion of what is excellence, which is really at the heart of what we think of when we think about, rigid forms of elitism, it's easy. It's just there. It's right in front of you. You just have to be willing to absorb it. So I think we have to go back to that. I don't know, like AAUP is like, don't just keep doing what you're doing. Don't preemptively shut down your DEI, which Rutgers just did something like that. I don't know if that is a good strategy, because if things are defunded, it may be harder to rebuild them, because this too shall pass. And there are ways to do things quietly. I'm sorry, but as my daughter, who's 19, just texted me that they just had a raid in Newark with ICE, and there was no warning. And a man I just sold, this lovely man, doesn't speak English yet. We communicated by Google Translate, just bought my car, and I'm like fearful for him because he works under the table in Newark. So, this is a bit of a war. I hope it doesn't get hot, but we need good strategy. And I don't think just pissing Trump people off is necessarily the best strategy, because they will take funds away. So this is going to be hard.
Thank you. I just want to turn to Micaela in the last minute that we have, because you worked on counterpublics, and do you want to say anything about this last question?
Just that I have been watching progressive counterpublic efforts, and I'm hoping we can all help them to expand as much as possible. And I'm part of that process myself.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're right at 2 p.m., which rarely happens in these kinds of meetings, I guess. So I want to thank our speakers once again, Carolyn Rouse, Alex Hinton, Micaela Leonardo, and Fred Damon for sharing their perspectives, their analyses with us. And thank you so much to all the participants for joining us. And we hope to see you in the future in our other Speaking Justice to Power events. Stay tuned, and thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.